Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has been released on PC, and we at DF got code to test the game just a few hours before launch. And, well, I've been on it, and my colleague Oliver McKenzie has also been on it. How you doing there, Oliver?
I'm doing great, Alex, but back to report a bit of a mixed outcome on this particular port, unfortunately.
Yeah, back in the day, we covered, actually, you specifically covered Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, I believe it's called.
That's correct.
And we had some less than positive words about that. But this time around, some more effort poured into this PC port, but as we'll be talking about later, there are some issues here, definitely. So, like any good PC video here, even one that's a dual VO, like we're doing right now, Oliver, I'm going to start first with the user experience and features. So, what is that looking like in this port of Rebirth here?
Yeah, so I just kind of wanted to cover some stuff that I think users will see immediately upon booting the game, basically, or rather not seeing in some cases. And these kind of fall under the category of weird issues because they're things we don't tend to see in good modern AAA PC ports, including, for instance, in some cases, in the recent PC port of Final Fantasy 16, which was quite different from this. But out of the box, right, with no mods, the game has no FSR support, no XeSS support, which are both very common upscalers that are often offered on PC. It has TAA, TAAU, and DLSS instead. It has no, and the DLSS version is 3.7, by the way. It has no frame generation support of any kind. So no DLSS 3 frame generation, FSR frame generation, XeSS frame generation. You're going to have to do that yourself with lossless scaling, perhaps, or a mod or fluid motion frames or something. There's no inbuilt support for that. DLSS doesn't have any available quality settings. Technically, there's just a DRS slider, and you basically can pick from the percentage equivalents of DLSS ultra performance, so 33% performance, 50% quality, 66%, or DLAA, which is 100%. There's no balance mode equivalent and no ultra quality mode equivalent, but you can set minimum DRS values as well as maximum. So if you want to do something like setting both to 66% or setting both to 100%, you can basically eliminate the DRS there. That's kind of how you get around it. It's a little clunky, but it works fine. And that same slider applies to TAA and TAAU as well. The game does not support a full screen mode. So to change the resolution of the game, you have to basically go into the desktop resolution and change that resolution. You can also change the resolution for the windowed mode manually, but that does not apply to the borderless full screen or borderless windowed resolution. So that's a little bit annoying, slightly annoying. And then in terms of support, there's no support for frame rates above 120 FPS, which is a bummer, a bit of a bummer because it means out of the box it doesn't really scale with future hardware. That's unfortunate. Also, there's no ultra-wide support and there's a locked FOV. So I'm sure the ultra-wide support, getting it to work in this game's many hours of cutscenes, I'm not expecting miracles here. Obviously, that would be a challenge. But for gameplay, it should be achievable. That should have been something they offered out of the box and then just kind of pillar boxing that those cutscenes in that ultra-wide experience. And finally, there is one weird issue that I did encounter on my own personal PC running the in-game FPS cap at 60 FPS at 60 hertz output, where the camera travel was just a little bit inconsistent from frame to frame. It's something I've noticed in a couple of other UE4 games like Ghost Runner or High on Life in their Xbox iterations there. It's hard to notice. I don't know if you'll notice it on YouTube. It's a little bit hard to see, but the camera motion is subtly incorrect here with VSync at 60 FPS using the in-game cap at 60 hertz output. I had to set a frame rate cap in the NVIDIA control panel to fix it, and it did fix it. It's kind of weird because there's a wide range of problems here. It does feel like Square Enix is not keeping totally up with PC conventions. FF16, again, was a lot more normal on PC. This is better than Remake in terms of its configurability. There's a lot more settings to configure and things like that. That's certainly welcome. But it's not 100% what we'd like to see. There's some obvious misses here, I think. Wouldn't you agree, Alex?
Yeah, I'd say especially lacking FSR at launch. That's something I don't actually like in any game that did it. And usually there's been excuses for it in the past that I found reasonable. For example, like Vulkan support of FSR being patchy and stuff like that for the latest 3.1 version. I found that somewhat reasonable. But in this, we're talking about a DirectX 12 title, UE4, UE5, under DirectX 12 all support FSR rather easily. It feels a little bit inexcusable at this point in time, but I'm happy to see that there is things like dynamic resolution scaling, DLSS is in there. There is TAAU. I really wouldn't use it, honestly, unless you're like talking Steam Deck here. There's a couple things. And also the options themselves, they go from high to low. Occasionally, some of them go to ultra. Some go from high, medium to low. Some just go to high and then low. And, I really wish there was, like a better kind of sense of what they did visually. In terms of a preview, a real-time preview would have been amazing, for example. I also think that the menus themselves, when you try and access them from in-game, are a little bit cluttered. You first go to like a pause menu, which then you have to go to options and then go to graphics. And I feel like that's a little overly nested and a lot of, especially on a controller, a lot of scrolling down to get to the obvious stuff. And this game is designed around a controller. You can play it obviously with the mouse and keyboard, but when you start it up the first time, it's one of those Steam games that says, this is better on a controller. So I would have expected a little bit better there. I'm also a little disappointed about the lack of ultra wide. I kind of think that's something that should come with a modern PC game, especially one that was designed around it. But this is a late port from PS5. So Oliver, how does this compare to the PlayStation 5 Pro?
Yeah, so I thought I'd chime in here with a bit of a comparison between this and PS5 Pro, because PS5 Pro, as I'm sure our audience knows, it's the premier place to play Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, or at least it has been until this PC release, potentially. And that's a release that was notably compromised in a few key areas. So draw distance was a problem, texture resolution was a problem, shadow resolution was a problem, indirect lighting quality was generally a problem. There were a number of like really obvious issues with this game that maybe stem a little bit from its UE4 heritage that were obviously compromised in ways that we didn't like to see. So hopefully we're hoping for some improvement on PC rather. And to me, the biggest improvement here comes down to draw distance. So that is improved quite a bit. It's not 100% perfect here, but it's improved quite a bit. So with the highest settings on PC, the pop-in isn't nearly as noticeable as on the PS5 Pro. It occurs much farther afield at max settings. It makes a pretty big difference in the areas that we tested, and it probably makes even a bigger difference, I'd say, in the later stages of the game, in Chapter 8 and Chapter 9, because it genuinely improves the game's image stability like quite a lot. There's no really obvious pop-in super close to the camera. It's much further afield, and you get better LODs out further into the distance there. So distant geometry looks a bit better. Also, texture resolution is improved at least some of the time. Now, the vast majority of the textures are the same as PS5. And I did spot a lot of really dodgy textures. So it's not a comprehensive improvement, but I did spot a couple textures at close range that were higher res. And in cutscenes, like in the pipes in this early sequence, I spotted a couple of cases where textures were improved as well. Most of the textures that did look dodgy, though, do look dodgy still on PC. I would emphasize that. There's no comprehensive high-res texture pass. It's pretty similar. Then there are some lighting tweaks that I noticed that were a little bit curious, and I think Alex might want to comment on this, but it seems like the opening area's indirect lighting looks quite different. It's warmer and brighter and maybe a little bit more natural feeling, but it's a little bit weird because it's just in that opening area. And obviously Square Enix did talk about improving the lighting quality on PC. And this is the thing that really did stand out to me. But I don't know if you have any comment on that, Alex. It just seems like a little bit of a weird change to me.
Yeah, I mean, they both don't look particularly great. Or also from a technical standpoint, they don't look like very different techniques. This game relied upon... like the old game, there are some light maps in here. There's also some sort of pro-based lighting for a lot of stuff in the indirect open world areas. And it isn't very accurate. And the differences we're seeing here in color tone, actually to me, do not map to any sort of significant technical difference. And I wonder if it is, in fact, this being a later release, them going back through with another art pass to change things. You know, they always say that you kind of go and polish the first area of a game last, because that is, after you have everything already, all the techniques are in place, then you go back into that first introductory area to make it really awesome as your last step in a game's development. And I do wonder if this is just another art polish phase. We kind of saw that with Integrate in general with the last game, and I wonder if that is what we're kind of seeing here. But in general, I wouldn't say it looks particularly that much better, honestly. It almost just looks like artistically different.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. It's like not it's not a huge difference. And the weird thing is that elsewhere in the game, the shadowing and the lighting is not really changed, which is weird again, because they did highlight that as a potential change. And they did talk even about, oh, maybe we can bring back the improvements from PC to PS5. But as far as I'm seeing, there aren't really many improvements to bring back. So like the biggest flaw with the lighting, perhaps, or one of the bigger flaws with lighting on PS5 was the shadow rendering, where they had cascaded shadow maps with a high-res cascade close to the camera, but further afield, it was all very low-res stuff, right? So it's still quite distracting here. Cloud shadow here, for instance, is very low-res, aliased, and soft, and it's a big issue in outdoor areas especially. Indoor areas have higher-res shadow maps typically. Outdoor areas, typically you see the biggest issue here. So you tend to see just like really low res shadows further afield from the camera, and then really distracting kind of shadow cascading when you do hit that really, really high res cascade, which is literally like probably 1 meter ahead of the player camera.
Yeah,
like it's
so
so
awkward,
close.
yeah.
It's so close. And then there are a couple of weird issues on PC that I did note. Like there are some bushes here that aren't rendering correctly. Then in this scene, you can see there's like a whole mound of grass that's not rendering correctly, so you just see the mound behind it. And then in a couple areas, I also noticed issues with the water, with this one stream in particular, where it looked like the transparency was not correct, that the water was not rendering correctly at all there. It might be a problem with water elsewhere. I only noticed it with that one stream, but it did look bizarre, like something that probably did not escape the notice of QA. I can't imagine, probably should have been fixed before release here. And then finally, I would just say, like, in general, most of the game's lighting problems that we saw on PS5 that I pointed out like a year ago in that review and the couple of review pieces I did, and then the PS5 Pro review that we did subsequent to that, most of them are still here. So like in Chapter 3, it looks pretty bad in both versions. There's like these glowing crystals that don't actually emit any light onto the scene. There's minimal shadowing in the scenes. There's no real sense of like light occlusion there at all. It just looks like really messy, and like it could use probably a lot of light maps and some decent ambient occlusion and something. It just does not look correct there. Outdoor areas I think generally look better, but some of these spots in particular indoors expose the weaknesses of lighting in this title pretty badly, because they moved away from a primarily like light map based solution to a solution that's more real time, and that just does not play that well with UE4 in my opinion. And then the cutscenes, this is another weird area. The cutscenes were reputed before launch to maybe have been improved, but there doesn't seem to be much improvement here at all, at least not broadly. The first area is a slight exception where those cutscenes do look slightly different in kind of color tone, like Alex said, between the two versions. And sometimes it seems like the character self-shadows are very slightly higher resolution on PC. You see a little bit less stair-stepping in them. They look a little bit more stable. But I have about half an hour of cutscene capture here, because I was really expecting those cutscenes to be different. And flipping back and forth, showing you them side by side, whatever I do here, you can see they're very, very similar. And that's not a complaint, because the cutscenes look really, really good. They look fantastic in both versions. I'm not complaining about that. But that was an area that people thought might have been improved, and it's not improved. So ultimately here, in terms of the graphical settings, my opinion, if you were looking for a big break with PS5, if you were looking for something that fixed the Pro version's remaining faults, mostly you're not getting that here. Pop-in is the big exception. And the other big exception, which I'm not going to cover in too much detail, but image quality can be way, way better on PC if you have the hardware for it. Like I'm comparing 4K DLA 3.7 on PC versus PSSR on PS5 Pro, and it's obviously no contest. Obviously the resolutions there aren't the same, but again, you can imagine if you're dealing with a high-end PC, if you have DLSS in there, you're basically getting like no noise, no shimmering, ultra-stable presentation. That's really to be expected, but even DLSS CNN model, or certainly the Transformer model, if you choose to inject that through the NVIDIA app, I think you're going to get a really good experience that cleans up some of those issues that we still noted with PSSR, with the noise, with the shimmer, with the instability, whatever. It should be quite a bit better on PC. So that's the other advantage there. But Alex, perhaps after getting through all that stuff, we should have a little chat about performance, because this is the area where I think the PC build kind of lets us down in a few key ways, unfortunately. And I think
Yeah.
it's something we do need to talk about a bit here.
Yeah, so I'm coming in from the perspective of we see a lot of PC games that launch with great performance, and then we see ones that don't launch with great performance. For example, I know it's a little bit unfair, but if you look at a game like, I don't know, let's say Indiana Jones, for example, that recently came out, it is a largely stutter-free experience, right? And then you come over to this game here, and it feels like on the surface level, it could be that way. But then you dig, well, not even that deep, and you can find actually a number of problems with performance in this game. And the first one, it actually comes with shader compilation. Now, the game does start with a not really too lengthy shader pre-compilation step. It'll be just over a minute and some on like a Ryzen 5 3600. It is obviously not doing too much there. And if you play through the game's beginning, now Oliver's got footage of this on his high-end PC. If you play through the game from its beginning, you notice that there's a lot of extra, even on his 13700K, there's a lot of extra kind of frame time spikes throughout cutscenes, or when camera cuts occur, or when something new shows up in a cutscene, new character shows up, or things like that. The first time you swing your sword, the first time you move around in the chocobo, like the little like hot air effect when you go really fast in the chocobo. All of these little things are accompanied by a stutter. And now the length of the stutter is going to depend. Now, I was playing on a Ryzen 5 3600 and doing all these kind of things, like the first time I swing my sword, the first time I stagger an enemy, these stutters could be between anywhere around 75 milliseconds, 150 milliseconds, or if multiple kind of shaders are being compiled within one frame, they could be up to 250 milliseconds or higher. And I saw that most egregiously because I also played the game using Oliver's save files. I loaded up the account he played on. I let the game do the shader pre-compilation on my Ryzen 5 3600 with an RTX 4060. And then I just loaded up, the calm area, however you want to pronounce it. And I'm immediately greeted by huge amounts of stuttering. And the thing is, if you play that side by side with just running through the town a second time again, it won't be having any shader compilation issues. That is how the game should be if we're designed really well in the modern PC climate where developers know and should know how to get rid of just-in-time shader compilation stutter. The thing is, it doesn't just happen because I played the game in this kind of semi-specific way where I loaded up Oliver's cuts. This will be happening any single time a new effect comes on screen for the first time, and it seems to be all throughout the gameplay experience, actually. It's just, I think a lot of people they just kind of take it for granted at this point in time. I went through the world, as a chocobo. Every single time I saw a new enemy, there was a stutter. Every single time I did a new type of attack move, every single time an enemy did a new type of attack move, they were all greeted by these shader compilation stutters. So they are doing a shader compilation burn at the beginning of the game, but it is not nearly complete enough. And I find that actually a big shame because other aspects of the port actually perform rather well. Running through the game on a high-end CPU like the Ryzen 7 9800X3D, if you run through the open world, even on an RTX 4060 with these settings I have on here, you're going to basically get little to no frame time perturbations at all. And this is an extreme rarity for any sort of Unreal Engine-based game. So if you have the CPU power there, you will actually get a rather stutter-free experience from the traversal side of things, as in there won't be that many, if any, traversal stutters on a high-end CPU. But you will still be getting shader compilation stutter. And the degree to you noticing it is a question on its own, but I'm of the humble opinion that in 2025, we should really be beyond this issue at this point in time. So I don't think that's very great. But Oliver, what do you think?
Yeah, I had a similar experience, but maybe not quite as pronounced because I was playing through the game in order. So, you're not just getting barrages of new shaders to comp in the moment there necessarily. But yeah, you can definitely notice it. Like in my footage here, I'm running through the first 30 minutes or so of the game, and you're seeing some big shader comps when, new characters are showing up, new effects are on screen, like a flamethrower effect, a new spark effect. The instructor is pushing his hand into your face, and you're getting a new effect, and you're getting that new shader, and now you need to wait a little bit for that to compile. But on my system, which has a 13700K, it was not as bad, and I was also limiting my frame rate to 60 FPS. I was trying to go for like 1080p 60 for that locked experience in the opening sections of the game. And generally they weren't too bad. Usually it was like going to, a 33 millisecond stutter, maybe at worst like a 50 millisecond stutter, at least in those areas. So it won't be as bad on higher end CPUs, but it's also still not great. So I can't advise that's a good experience. For me, I did a couple of rounds of testing. I basically started off with some testing. Yeah, my machine, which has a 13700K and a 4090, I could have tested with a 5090, but I thought that'd be a bit cheeky because it's not released yet. And by the time this video is out, I don't think it will have been released. So I don't think that's an appropriate thing to do necessarily. But for me, outside of the shader comp issue, which is a big issue, and I don't mean to downplay that is a big issue. But for me, 4K 60 was generally achievable just fine with DLA at max settings. I tested in some of the most challenging encounters on PS5, a big boss fight. PC fared just fine there. The only real issue came in the towns where I could see like little drops here and there from that VSync lock there. Maybe a little tiny dip here and there. Nothing that severe. It's not perfect. Then without the frame rate cap, I was getting like 80 to 100 FPS there at 4K 60. I also tested it 1440p 120, which my system actually managed pretty well. And here, I was quite impressed to not see that traversal stutter that you're talking about, Alex. Like, we are not really seeing traversal stutter. Smaller environments also run really, really well. It's just the cities that tended to run a bit worse for me. I don't think the frame times were necessarily that bad. Like, when I played with VRR, it felt okay. But you are getting some dips there, some CPU-limited dips on my system, again at 1440p max settings. I also quickly just tried 1440p ultra performance just to isolate the GPU for sure. And yeah, I was seeing the same CPU related drops in the city. So broadly speaking, past the shader comp issue, which is a big issue, it is annoying, but to some degree over time you do get past that, even if it is like really impactful to that early experience and shouldn't exist really. You are basically getting, I would say, on a high-end system at least, a pretty good experience in terms of frame times throughout most of the game, with just cities giving you a little bit more issues, especially if you're trying to hit 120 FPS straight there. So yeah, overall, on a high-end system, some good, some bad, but on a mid-range system, a little bit more bad than good, unfortunately, in some respects here.
Yeah, and there's actually more to that, unfortunately. Now, this isn't something I would actually blame the game for, but if you do have a mid-range CPU and I would say rather common mid-range GPU, there's a number of other things you have to watch out for. So the first I would say is actually texture quality. If you have an 8 gigabyte GPU and potentially even a 10 gigabyte GPU, you're going to want to decrease the texture quality setting. Now, running through the calm area, it's really easy to see that the high texture quality actually is quite too high for an 8 gigabyte GPU, even at 1080p. Just looking at these three-way side-by-sides, there is a large frame time spike that'll occur periodically each time you run through this area, for example. On the high texture setting, that won't happen there. On the medium and the low texture setting. And now the differences between the texture setting is actually rather minor between medium and high, especially if you are targeting something like 1080p. I don't think you'll really notice it. But when you get down to the low setting, it looks like they're just quarter resing everything. And I found that pretty easy to notice. Now, I would have thought that even on medium, an 8 gigabyte GPU would be enough for 1080p, but having played the game a bit more, I found that not to be the case. Basically, if you traverse the world rapidly using a 8 gigabyte GPU, even on the medium texture setting, and then you, for example, go from the plains out into the cities like Calm, or just even discover new areas of the map, what you'll tend to find is that they will induce a hitch And this hitch will be anywhere from 75 to 150 milliseconds or so. And it will actually occur every single time you do that when you traverse larger distances and then kind of go through like invisible barriers that the game has set up. That happened on the medium texture setting, and very importantly, did not happen on the low texture setting. Essentially, this means that if you have an 8 gigabyte GPU, the only way to get a completely stutter-free experience from the texture streaming side of things is actually to use the low texture quality, which I find is brutal given the quality of the textures when set to low in this game. That is one I don't want to fully peg on the developers here. 8 gigabytes at this point in time isn't exactly a stellar amount of GPU VRAM, but it is a little bit surprising to see, given the fact that this game uses direct storage. But it is using a rather old vintage of Unreal Engine, and who's to say what type of virtual texturing or not they are using here to really fit in the textures in this game. So that is one thing to keep mind of. On a 10 gigabyte GPU, medium will probably be enough for the entire experience, and you won't have to worry about it. Another thing that I noticed is that yes, when running across the game world or even through most of the towns, you can get a really nice frame time graph there, usually on a high-end CPU like the 9800X3D here, even if you're on an RTX 4060. Seriously, it is so much smoother than I've pretty much seen in every single Unreal Engine 4 and Unreal Engine 5 title. I find that is an incredible part about this port. But if you're on something lower, like a Ryzen 5 3600, I will say it is anything but a smooth experience. You're essentially getting, constant, when you just move throughout the game world, frame tick spikes up to like 25, 33 milliseconds all the time. And it comes in bouts too. You can actually see it when it's happening on the frame time graph. It looks smooth, and all of a sudden it goes, and then it smooths out again. And then you move a bit further and it happens again. That happened on the Ryzen 5 3600 on like the high settings, as well as happening on all of everything set to the lowest settings. So there isn't actually a way to get around poor frame times on a CPU like the Ryzen 5 3600. You're just going to have to kind of put up with the fact that this game was not designed around that CPU, probably from a core count perspective, and also probably a little bit from an IPC perspective. So it probably requires 8 cores, I'd imagine, for a really nice stable experience there, and something like a Ryzen 5000 series. That is a bit of a shame, of course, because in the past, you've looked at a lot of titles. Ryzen 5 3600 is usually pretty bang on for something like the PS5 CPU in a lot of games, but here it just really isn't cutting it.
Yeah, and the PS5 is like almost a locked 60 FPS in terms of traversing through cities and places like that. So to not see that same behavior on a CPU that's usually quite PS5 equivalent is a bit disappointing here. That is a bit disappointing.
So the last thing I want to talk about here is that I did discover Oliver talked about some of visual bugs earlier. I found some of my own as well, some performance bugs, both on the 9800X3D and on the Ryzen 5 3600. At multiple times, I could get the game to completely lock up and dive down to 0 FPS for a moment and then return maybe 5 seconds later. I really have no idea what was causing it. I was using like the low textures at the time. I wasn't like seeing VRAM go nuts or something like that. But it did happen a couple times. Another time when I was doing open world traversal, then moved into the city, which I found a great test, the LOD stopped loading at one point, and I don't know what caused it. I was talking with our colleague John about this, and he said, "Oh, I saw this also in a couple other Unreal Engine titles." I don't know if that has any bearing on this here, but yeah, maybe you'll have times, even we're on a high-speed NVMe, the game just doesn't load LODs for some reason. So that is something to catch out for, and I think like it might be more exacerbated on the lower end systems out there, but I can't exactly test that because I didn't know what was causing this issue to occur in the first place to reproduce it. So that's really what I got to say there.
Yeah. So speaking of these lower end systems, I think the lowest end system that anyone would commonly use to play this game is probably the Valve Steam Deck. So I thought I'd take a quick look at that, a quick overview look at that, because I don't have days and days and days to put into Steam Deck testing, but I just wanted to see if it works and how well it works on a basic level. So the game is Steam Deck verified, which indicates it's weapons free on this one, to take a take a crack at it because it really should be in good shape. So I use the lowest settings preset, which has a 50% DRS minimum. And I also put on a 30 FPS cap, and I'm using TAAU, which is also in the low settings preset. My basic impressions there kind of follow from PC, where the cities are for sure an issue on Steam Deck. Now, I ran into an issue where weirdly the over budget frames were dropping to 66 milliseconds instead of at least 50 milliseconds some of the time, with the system at 60 hertz output and the system level 30 FPS cap. That was weird. So I switched from that to the in-game 30 FPS cap instead, and then it produced some weird frame pacing issues. The frame times were not, I was getting over budget frames that were like 50 milliseconds there instead of 66, but the frame times were all messed up there. So yeah, that's not ideal necessarily. But anyways, going back to that original capping method there, it does drop in the cities. It's not totally smooth. But in the outdoor areas, it runs very well. And indoors, it's mostly locked 30 FPS. The DRS actually works great. If you look at the little GPU stats, the GPU is almost always fully occupied. The frequency is high. The resolution looks, certainly better than it would if you'd set a lower DRS maximum there. And it's always producing 33 millisecond frames without being GPU limited technically too badly there. So I'd recommend keeping DRS on. It seems to work very well in the Steam Deck. If you do want to dial up the settings though, I did try medium settings. It runs extremely poorly. But low settings, on a little 7-inch display, it doesn't look great. It's got very poor draw distance, poor shadow resolution, but at least it runs all right enough. And like the TAAU plus the DRS, it mostly produces like a decent looking image from a resolution perspective, from a clarity perspective. It's all right. So I would say this is better than a lot of other recent higher end AAA titles recently, probably here. I think you'd probably be of a similar view there, Alex.
Yeah, I think the whole concept of Steam Deck Verified these days is a bit muddy. Because yes, this is playable there, but it is not exactly a really super enjoyable experience from a visual or performance perspective, depending upon where you are looking or where you are in the game. And, it's better than we've seen with other titles in terms of performance based upon what you're showing me. But it still isn't exactly great. And this probably would be a title that would love a Steam Deck 2 in a lot of ways, from a CPU perspective, especially, which you can definitely see when you went to those medium settings there. But yeah, so not the best, but it is kind of reasonable. So Oliver, coming to the end of this video here, where we've covered quite a lot actually over a large period of time, what are your final thoughts on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth?
Yeah, so I basically just wanted to close out here with a couple scattered thoughts that didn't fit well into the rest of our sections here. So I did check out some mods. It's possible to uncap the game's FPS using a couple solutions. There are some mods that aim to fix, in quotes here, the visuals by removing a lot of the post-processing and possibly also doing things like increasing shadow resolution, which, some of those are helpful, some are not helpful, not necessarily helpful. More usefully, there are mods to add DLSS 4, frame generation, FSR3, XCSS, the whole bag, mods to add FOV support and ultrawide support partially, and even a mod amusingly to remove the yellow paint on climbing holds. So if that's something that annoys you, in modern games, the use of kind of highlights to show you areas that you can actually interact with. In modern games that have complex lighting and complex geometry, it's quite helpful. But if you don't like that, you can possibly get a mod to turn that off. So that's very helpful. So if anything we've discussed so far bothers you, especially in that first section where we were complaining about kind of weird issues, mods may exist currently and will probably exist in the future to help you with some of those issues. There's a bit of nonsense in the mod selection on Nexus mods as well, but I think there's a bit of a low-hanging fruit here where for the frame rate cap, FSR, XCSS, frame gen, FOV changes, the shadow resolution, these are all stuff that should probably be able to be changed without a lot of work. And it seems like it's kind of ridiculous that we have to go to mod authors for potentially solutions to some of these problems. So I'd like to see those issues addressed with some patching effort there. But ultimately, like my final thoughts in the game, I think this is probably better than FF7 Remake on PC, in part because there are a good number of graphical settings to configure. It supports DLSS at least and TAU, so you have some upsampling solutions there. But the return of shader comp stutter is really unfortunate, especially considering that at least some effort seems to have gone into this game to try to fix it. It wasn't enough, apparently. It's not great to see stuttering problems as well, especially on lower end builds, lower end CPUs and Steam Deck there. I did go back to FF7 Remake on my system just to see exactly how bad the stuttering issues were relative to Rebirth in its current form. And in the first town area, which is again a lot smaller than the town areas in Rebirth, they had harder stutters than I saw on the PC. It had some stutters down to 33 milliseconds on my PC at 120 hertz output, whereas Rebirth is almost always at a level where it's like kind of, giving you at least a 60 FPS experience that's good. And then the frame times are not so messy at 120 FPS necessarily. But it's important to note that's just using the DX12 version. If you go to the DX11 version, I bet those frame times are probably a lot better there, at least based on my old impressions of that port from 3 years ago. It should be quite a bit better. The final thing to note with this port is it does support non-PlayStation pads better. So there are button glyphs that match the Xbox controllers. For instance, if you remember FF7 Remake on PC, what they would do is they'd put the PlayStation button icon on screen, and then they put the Xbox one above it in a less stylized form. So here they actually just give you the Xbox button icons. There's also a musical sequence where you have to time button presses to certain beats. And in that musical sequence, they've replaced the PlayStation button icons with Xbox ones, so it looks correct there. It's not like discordant. They're not like doubling up on the button icons. It looks pretty good. My only real complaint is that the vibrations seem calibrated a bit more for DualSense than for Xbox pads. So those like really subtle haptics that you get on the DualSense when you're, say, swimming through water or when you're riding through Chapter 2 on a chocobo going full speed there, and you're getting like nice like pitter patter on the chocobo on the haptics there. That on an Xbox pad is just very hard vibration. So they are mapping that into something on the Xbox pad, but I think they probably shouldn't have any vibration on the Xbox pad because it's not capable of that level of subtlety, right? It's just that's not what it's tuned for necessarily. So yeah, overall, I think this can be a serviceable way to play the game, especially on a higher end PC. The graphical settings are slightly better than consoles in some respects, so there are some issues. That's unfortunate. And there's not a lot of configurability for non-NVIDIA systems, non-16:9 displays, people who want to target like really high frame rates, things like that. That's all not great. There's stuttering issues, shader comp issues, whatever. I'm kind of worn down by this point. I don't know if you can tell, but it's certainly an unfortunate list of issues that I don't think should have shipped in this game, and I hope they are resolved, and I think you'd probably share that sentiment, Alex.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel about it. In 2025, a company as large and as rich as Square Enix releasing for what is the most like popular platform for these kind of, AAA games. Like there are so many Steam users, and yet one of the like core tenets and core aspects of the PC is that you have to solve shader compilation. And there's been so many presentations, documentation. Unreal Engine has advanced in its own right in this capacity over time in Unreal Engine 5, for example. And to see it ship with such incomplete shader compilation, even though it seems like they did something there, I think is actually a rather large failing. And I don't think it should be acceptable anymore in the year 2025 after amount of time, especially, you're paying a hefty sum to play a new AAA game on Steam. So I just don't think it should be there at all. And I think that is a big failing of this port. The other aspects you mentioned, I also don't think are too great, but one thing I do want to praise though, is at least on a higher end CPU, 8 cores, relatively good IPC, you're going to be getting a lot better experience than you got in the last title under DX12. And you're also going to be getting generally a lot better open world traversal experience than you would have gotten in any other Unreal Engine game. I think, oh my goodness, if I could just say that about every other aspect of this port instead of having to pile on criticism, I would have loved that. But that isn't the case. They shipped some stuff incomplete, some stuff not ready. And that shows in the end. If I can just load it up within 5 minutes and immediately find pretty obvious problems, then what does that say, right? So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yes, I'd have to agree here, but I think with this fairly exhaustive and broad video, I think we've basically exhausted all that we've wanted to say here. So if you did happen to enjoy this little rant between Alex and I, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media. And from Alex and I,
Auf Wiedersehen.
Wiedersehen.